Whilst at hotel school, I then became involved in a movement called the YCW, the Young Christian Workers, which the apartheid state referred to as the Young Communist Workers. And they probably were very right in it. In that, in the YCW, we were groomed and educated in seeing religion and faith as a way of life, and not just a goody-goody prayer Christian type of thing. It was extremely radical, radical in the context of educating young people to become active citizens in changing their conditions, be it unemployed, be it at work, be it at school, be it with the civic movement. But the idea was that the YCW would educate you of how to propose action and how to organize action to change a situation. And not just as we referred to then in the YCW, it wasn't just about shouting a mandla. It was more than that. It was about participating in transforming whatever situation you had come across. So, at a very youthful age already, I was introduced into activism and had become an activist. And one of the most interesting and first sort of actions that we had participated in mass was the Wilson Roundtree boycott, the consumer boycott. Now, Wilson Roundtree was a British multinational, and the black workers in East London wanted to organize themselves into the trade union, which at the time was SAU, South African Allied Workers Union. And because Wilson Roundtree wouldn't give them recognition, they then went out on strike, and as a result of the strike, they then had called for a consumer boycott as a tactic to put pressure on the company. But what it meant for us in the YCW was that we should then go around pronouncing to different congregations of the Catholic Church about the consumer boycott. We would have to go around to different areas pronouncing the consumer boycott and ask people to write letters to the newspapers, to ask the local shops not to stock the Wilson Roundtree produce and to promote a consumer boycott of Wilson Roundtree products. So at that level we would volunteer to do that, but we'd also volunteer on a Saturday mornings at the trade union office to interview workers who would come to the union to lodge complaints, to sign up for membership. So on a Saturday we would do that. So that was one of the many ways that the YCW schooled us about activism and how that becomes a tool for understanding what is happening in society.
This part of Woodstock is probably part of the older parts of the making of the Woodstock, and I think it had a lot to do with the geography because one of the stones that we found inside the building was dated 1901. Okay. So if you look at the architecture and the design of most of the houses up on the slope here, and even the church, it's most of them are well over 60 years, close to 100 years, right? So the making of Woodstock is also the making of an immigrant community. I mean, this is the Greek Orthodox Church, but at the back of it you could also find the old Anglican Church, probably one of the oldest ones around here, and down at the bottom you could also find another Anglican church. So to look at the history and the development of the area, the establishment of institutions such as faith-based institutions is a good indicator of how long people have been around, and the fact that, for example, the Greek Church today, many of the congregants do not necessarily live in the area, but they still commute to come to worship and to do all the cultural activities. And it's very much the same within District 6. With the demise of District 6 and the displacement of people, a lot of the faith-based institutions were not demolished, and people continued to commute even up till today. You get people commuting to places of worship within District 6. The other connection, which is a personal connection for myself and the hospital, is when I was diagnosed as a diabetic and had to go on chronic medication. It was here that I had to come for my chronic medication on a monthly basis and for my examination from time to time. So that was my connection to the Woodstock Hospital. The room that I now occupy was one of the doctor's consulting rooms that I had to go into for examination and consultation. So my doctors moved out and I moved.
You moved in. And was it a conscious choice?
No,
Just happened.
it was just ironic.
Yeah,
I mean, I mean, it was never even at the time of choosing the room.
Yeah.
It was just, okay, this is the room that's I can have, and yeah, it's fine. And it's afterwards that it occurs. I think what sort of happens with the post-apartheid development of the area, with the gentrification of the area, a complete new style of urban planning, architectural layout starts to emerge. A large development is geared towards individual styled apartments, high-rise apartments, rather than the individual separated private ownership of individual houses. But that also meant an introduction of a new form of community, a community that's largely being now created with either individual child family or a very singular type of occupant, and that's what has come to be declared as the coffee shop community.
Yeah.
Because the space that the individual occupies inside the building may be so small that it doesn't enable lots of visitation, but so at least in the coffee shop you could have
cappuccinos
for a
around the
cappuccino and
so it's a kind of sign of a gentrification process.
Right,
yeah.
Right. Normally with urban planning, and particularly British urban style planning, the hospital, the school, the house, would have all been components of that urban layout design. So I think as the hospital sort of got established with a very significant number of residents taking up occupancy, I think it could be more or less within the same period. And even if you look at the style of the architectural design, it would probably be in a similar period. So this part of the hospital, we think could have been the first sections of the hospital, and this would have been the incinerator towers. Okay. So they must, because from the inspection on site, you could get a sense of what type. It wasn't a space for wards or anything, and so this would have been the very earlier first parts. When we started to have an engagement with the city, it was relatively accessible to get support for the attention of certain things, right? when there was a political shift in the Democratic Party, a shift that became more right-wing, things also shifted in as far as the officials that we were engaged with were withdrawn. So there was a breakdown in the communication and a breakdown in engagement with the city. So that became more challenging. The officials who were willing and ready and prepared to go the extra mile were now under pressure. One of them, in actual fact, resigned, and she was quite a champion of our cause. The others that continued with employment were now far more cautious to be seen to be engaging with us here because of the political arrangements within the civic center. And so they then became inaccessible. And one of the biggest challenges that we had with them becoming inaccessible is, for example, they would assist with clearing and cleaning and cutting and so fixing the sewage pipes and all of that. So when there was the withdrawal of the bureaucrats from engaging with us, everything collapsed. Wow. This is what we're talking about, the gentrification of Woodstock. I think that's one of the wax buildings. It may be wax and the iron works. I'm not exactly sure, but that's the form of the development that is taking place within Woodstock now, and that would largely be your studio, your bachelor type of apartments. That, as you can see, it's very compact, and in all of them, what is happening is what is referred to as inclusionary housing. Because the city at this stage hasn't got a policy of inclusionary housing, developers are free to design and to consider any form of inclusionary housing, but very often it's a consideration not well accepted by developers. And part of the reason for that is that, in a way, it reduces the overall level of income for the development when there has to be that consideration. So as we can see, I mean, if you probably stand here, you can see all the developments that are relatively new are all high-rise apartment style development. There hasn't been yet the development for what we refer to as social housing. Okay, there are plans afoot, but there's not a single brick laid yet. For example, most social housing developments has a means test of an income between 3,000 and 15,000. Now, if you are unemployed, the chances of you having an income of 3,000 is very slim. If you are a pensioner, the income of you and your partner having a maximum income of 3,000 is also very slim. So if you are relying purely on a state pension, you would not make that. So the issue of social housing needs to be examined and to be reconstituted, in my view, for consideration of is that threshold under the existing circumstances, post-COVID, during COVID, does it lend itself to a very fair opportunity to access social housing when unemployment is on the increase, income levels is on the decrease, and so the policies surrounding social housing has not shifted to the social conditions that is prevalent at this point in time, and that needs to, in my view, needs an emergency type of examination as to whether that approach under the prevailing conditions still lends itself for social housing.
Are there any signs of possibilities? Is Reclaim the City involved in discussions, or does it look like things are not moving in that direction?
I think part of the big challenge for us is that COVID-19 has sort of imposed on us a situation that we had not anticipated. And so we've had to begin to reflect different ways of organizing, and a lot of energy has gone into resisting evictions as a result of people losing income. So there's been quite a heavy pressure on people being able to afford their obligations. And so as a result of that, also the contrast also happens. It's a new opportunity for property owners to radically increase rentals and to put pressure on those families that have had the opportunity to enjoy lower rentals to now being faced with higher rentals as a result of the inability to pay, so they can be evicted, and those who are by the means now move in very quickly. So there's no sort of balance between what has happened to low income earners and the impact COVID-19 has had on their affordability to continue with those rentals. Okay. So this part of the hospital is our garden plan, and so what we have here is basically an initiative by some people who wanted to become involved in gardening, and so they plant and produce lettuce, beetroot, fennel, spinach, cabbages, potatoes, spring onions, and a significant number of what they produce is used in the kitchen, which we have a production kitchen here, but also shared with occupiers here as well, to allow them to also, as a form of engagement. And we saw that when I was part of a brigade that visited Barcelona last year, that we saw in another former psychiatric hospital that was also occupied by activists in Barcelona, how they've invited the surrounding community to participate in the making of their garden. One of the big challenges that we have is that, as you can see on the different side of the fence, is space for the children to play. Hello, how are you? Hi. Okay. And also to have a regular cleanup session here. So, I mean, you can see how right around the complex we are trying to use different spaces for different purposes. I mean, over here you can see all the washing lines. So a lot of people hang their washing here. Good afternoon. Don't go in the road, please.
We love each other.
Okay. We're going into Salisbury Road, and we want to talk about some of the businesses, and you will see also that a lot of the architecture and the design of the houses has a high-rise stoop or elevated patio that gave them a elevated view of Woodstock and the harbour and so. But we were talking about some of the social interactions with people in the occupation. Gender-based violence and conflict between neighbours has become very challenging. And we've, in actual fact, very interestingly today started soliciting support from other groups of what we want to make a reference to, what we call a community mediation intervention. We're hoping that we can get some support for the creation of what we will make reference to as a community mediation team to make an intervention between fighting, arguing groups or individuals, and then make recommendations to what we refer to the disciplinary committee. And the reason for that is that, is that if we're able to get that right, it will take a lot of pressure off the leaders who have to constantly make an intervention and deal with the unsocial behavior between occupiers. This is one of the very interesting spaces still left behind of Woodstock. These lanes were largely designed and created for the collection of sewage. So many of the people here would have had the bucket toilet system before waterborne sewage systems was introduced. So you needed to have a wide enough space for the horse and cart to get into the back sections, right? And so as you can see, I mean, this was in 1939, right? So if you take the hospital 1901, you take the school 1900 and something, you take the church 1939. So there's a development that takes place, okay, in the 1900s. If you look at the architectural design of the windows, and a friend of mine who was into urban planning told me one of the things that has always been an irony about architecture is that this was suitable in Europe for the coldness.
Yes.
Unlike in Africa where we have a lot of sunshine,
we should have wide open windows. Exactly.
So I mean, that's a classic example of what people started doing. Okay, the aluminium frame, the wider window, as opposed to the style of window. Then also, you over there you could see with the chain chimneys, right? The solar panels on the roof now. Yeah. So you can see the architectural adaptation over different periods. Okay. Because there's an existing community that is occupying a particular space, that is not necessarily wanting to have individual ownership, but is want to engage with a communal form of ownership. And what should that communal form of ownership be like? That is not determined yet. And so the idea of the common to be of ownership by the community, and how that ownership is implemented, executed, lived, experimented with, is the advantage of Sissigul House. By bringing in different people into different spaces, it's beginning to take a form of its own. And that's what I like about the notion of engaging with the idea of a common space, of a common, and how Sissigul provides that opportunity. Probably been the first part of the hospital, but it's also now become a part that is referred to as a zanya. So the people living here have separated themselves from RTC. So there's a few that are participants in RTC. But a few months ago, the city council here tried to bring in a caravan of some sort for law enforcement. Okay, so they placed it here without any negotiation, without any form of engagement with the community here or with us down there. And so what was interesting was that there was a big united front to evict the law enforcement, and we were successful in getting it out. And when law enforcement tried to engage to bring it back, there was sufficient opposition to them bringing it back into the space again. So we were able to move it out, and then we had to then persuade them that for as long as the caravan is here, there's going to be hostilities between the two parties. And the officer, captain, whatever, whoever was in charge, then consented, okay, let's go off and go and have a conversation, but for now we're moving the caravan out and the people off site. So we now at the back of what is referred to as Long Street. So this whole complex here is part of Long Street, and this becomes the first part of the occupation when the occupation starts. Okay, so as you can see here, right, here and over here, okay, those are the signs of when they were making, when the space was being used for the making of movies. So it was directed at a foreign Arabic community. So because they were doing movie shoots in here, there used to be electricity and water. Okay. And the city would generate income from hiring the space for that. So this would have been, so this section here would have been the first part of the occupation. Okay, and this was called Long Street.
Yeah.
Okay, so at the time, what went down in Long Street, in town also went down here, the party and all of that. So, but this is where the occupation starts. Okay, so we were about originally 10 people, and then 30 people, and then later on, when we opened up this section, we were close to about 50 odd people. Hello. So we were close to about 50 odd people that had expanded down here. So now this was the Dr. Ivan Tom's men's clinic.
Yeah.
Okay. So we now at the back of the entrance of the men's clinic. So this section was the only section that was completely occupied. What happened subsequently is that when the day hospital section, which we're going into, was disused, we then immediately started populating that, and then we then started to populate the whole building. Now, so this space here is called Bromwell Street. Okay. Now, Bromwell Street is important to the whole occupation and to the whole campaign about displacement in Woodstock, because this is where we basically begin to consolidate some of the work. And so Bromwell Street becomes the first campaign around displacements for RTC. As you can see, this one is called Green Market Square. Okay. And so it's linked with the greenery around here, and it's a small space. And so we've tried to sort of use the names of spaces and places that people can connect with, you see. Okay, let's go into Albert Road here. Okay, so Albert Road is very interesting in that when the gentrification process starts, this is one of the places where people are being proposed to be evicted. Okay, and so when that started to happen, we then said, look, if they win the case, it's all right. If they lose the case, we've got to have spaces where people can go to, and we then reserved part of the space for people. So most of the people coming here are coming from what was referred to as the building in Albert Road, where they lost their case. But they were fortunate to get an 8 months reprieve, to be slowly finding alternative accommodation. What had happened is that there was a fire in the building, and the owners didn't want to repair because they wanted to sell the property. So they let the building become extremely derelict to the point where they now were going to sell the property, and with the sale of the property, people had to find alternative accommodation. So this is what we had to do to enable people to have an alternative. So this would have been the back part of the day hospital. Remember we said that there were still sections that was active. So this is where the Woodstock Community Health Clinic would still be active. So up to where Albert Road ends, and this part here, you can't see now, here. You see those colorful markers would have been where you would have to go upstairs to different aspects, the physio, the nutrition, x-ray, so you would come through here and would follow those lines. So this lines here, when the day hospital was operative, this would be what was referred to as your essentials. So this is your first stop. Okay? Your blood pressure, your sugar levels, your temperature, all of that. But what we've done in our section, this is Darling Gardens. One of the parents that live here, her son is a creative artist. So we got him to do some creativity in our section rather than to have the painting. It's not finished, but we hope that we will continue now to do some of that. So that's
never imagined that you would one day be living in.
Not at all. Not at all. So this is the kind of space most rooms would be.
Yes.
It's how you rearrange it and organize it, and so I'm in the process of a major overhaul of creating more space and more efficient space for me. So this is how I live. What we know is that the neighbors have been sort of lodging complaints about the unsocial behavior and the non-adherence to the lockdown time regulations by a number of the occupiers, and that is a big worry for us. To what extent would the criminal activities by a few individuals jeopardize it and be held against us? So I think this is important that we look at what we've done with this space. This is our meeting room, it's our office, it's our library, it's a safe space for the children. And we've been able to renovate the space for meeting purposes, for conversations, for safe spaces for the children to come and do homework, and when we need to do overhead projector screenings. It's 24/7. I mean, just to give you an example of an ordinary weeknight, right? From Monday to Sunday. On Monday night we have leadership meetings. On a Tuesday night you have another form of leadership called the monitors meeting. On the Wednesday, in the different sections which we've walked through, you would have that sectional meetings. On a Thursday, what the leadership didn't finish off on the Monday night is then either taken up on the Thursday night. If that's not happening, then we would have what we call the advised assembly meetings for the whole group. On a Friday night, we have the disciplinary hearings, the DC hearings. On a Saturday, it's either workshops or something. On a Sunday, it would be something or the other. So that could be just in 1 week.
Cool. When do you rest?
You never rest.
Have you ever done activism of this sort? Surely not. Because this is so intense.
Not
relentless.
Not at this magnitude, even when I worked in the trade union movement.
Because it went home at some point.
In the trade union movement, it was always intense when there was strikes.
Yes.
When there was work stoppages, strikes, lawful or unlawful, there'd be the consideration of, even in collective bargaining for wage negotiations and conditions of employment, it would be intense, but not as consistent as this. Okay, but it was a good foundation for negotiating skills, for planning skills, for people's management skills, for getting people to also understand different points of views and how you've got to, within your own organization, find consensus. What those consensus mean for everybody and how that consensus must represent what everybody aspires to. And so those challenges of moving from a point of just a demand into negotiating the demand, into compromising the demand, were very rich spaces to learn from. So that by the time I became active in this particular space, my trade union skills, my trade union experience was quite valuable.